The evening air carried a slight chill as Sandra Bullock stared at the cream-colored invitation on her kitchen counter. She traced her finger over the embossed gold lettering announcing the annual Hope Foundation Charity Gala. Sandra sighed, picking up her cup of tea. These events always left her feeling a bit out of place even after decades in Hollywood. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Car confirmed for Saturday. Sure you don't want me to come along?" Sandra typed back. "I'll be fine on my own. Thanks, though." She preferred attending these events quietly these days without the fuss of an entourage. The Hope Foundation did important work for children's education, a cause close to her heart. That's why she'd agreed to attend, despite knowing the crowd would be filled with Beverly Hills socialites who often seemed more interested in being seen than in actual charity. She walked to her closet, sliding hangers across the rack until she found a simple black dress. Nothing flashy, just elegant enough for the occasion. Sandra wasn't trying to make headlines. She just wanted to support the cause and maybe enjoy a nice dinner. Across town, Keanu Reeves was just landing at LAX. He looked tired as he rolled his small suitcase through the terminal, having flown straight from a film set in Europe. His manager met him at arrivals. "You made it just in time," his manager said, handing him a coffee. "The gala's tomorrow night." "I wouldn't miss it," Keanu replied, taking a grateful sip. "The foundation helped fund that children's hospital wing last year. A lot of big names will be there," his manager continued, scrolling through his phone. "Including your old friend Sandra." Keanu smiled at the mention of his former co-star. They didn't see each other often, but whenever they did, it was like no time had passed. It'll be good to see her. Back at her home, Sandra was going through her emails when she noticed a message from the Hope Foundation, thanking her for her recent donation. She'd given a substantial amount, but had requested to remain anonymous. Sandra believed in helping, quietly, without making a show of it. She thought about calling her friend Judy to see if she'd be at the gala too, but decided against it. Sometimes it was easier to attend these things alone. Less pressure, easier to slip out early if needed. Sandra closed her laptop and went to bed, setting her alarm for an early morning run before preparations for the gala. The next day passed, quickly. Sandra spent the morning going over lines for an upcoming project, then met with her hairstylist in the afternoon. By evening, she was ready, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, her makeup natural but polished. As her car pulled up to the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, Sandra took a deep breath. Camera flashes were already lighting up the entrance, as celebrities and socialites made their way inside. She waited for a moment before stepping out, hoping to avoid the main crush of photographers. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in white linen. Waiters glided between guests carrying trays of champagne. Sandra accepted a glass with a smile and scanned the room, recognizing many faces from both Hollywood and the local society pages. A group of women at a central table caught her attention. They sat like queens holding court, dripping in diamonds, their laughter carrying across the room. Sandra recognized Tiffany Wilson, wife of a studio executive, and her friends. They were known as the Golden Circle, women who controlled much of the social scene and charity circuit in Beverly Hills. Sandra chose a seat at a less prominent table, chatting politely with a retired director and his wife. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Tiffany and her friends watching her, whispering behind their hands. She'd experienced this before, the sideways glances, the barely concealed judgments. After years in the public eye, she'd developed a thick skin, but it still stung sometimes. Across the room, Keanu was just arriving. He straightened his tie as he entered, nodding to familiar faces. Several people stopped him to chat, delaying his progress through the crowded room. The event organizer, a nervous young woman with a clipboard, intercepted him. "Mr. Reeves, we're so honored you could make it. We'd love to have you say a few words later if you wouldn't mind." Keanu smiled warmly. "Of course, happy to help." His eyes continued scanning the room until he spotted Sandra. He was about to head her way when the foundation's director pulled him aside to discuss the new youth center project. Meanwhile, Sandra excused herself to visit the restroom. As she passed near Tiffany's table, she couldn't help overhearing their conversation. "Did you see what she's wearing?" Tiffany whispered, not quite quietly enough. "That dress must be seasons old." Another woman with a tight blonde updo leaned in. "Well, she's not exactly relevant anymore, is she? When was her last hit movie?" "I heard she was difficult on her last project," added a third, twisting her pearl necklace. "My husband's cousin works in production and said she's become quite the diva." Sandra kept walking, her face betraying nothing. In the restroom, she took a moment to collect herself, touching up her lipstick in the mirror. She'd long ago learned not to let such comments bother her, but she was human. It hurt to be dismissed so casually by people who didn't even know her. When she returned to the main room, the first course was being served. Sandra settled at her table, making pleasant conversation with her tablemates, a kind elderly couple who supported many charities and a younger woman who worked for a nonprofit. None of them treated her like a celebrity, which was refreshing. From his position near the stage, Keanu finally spotted Sandra again. He noticed how she smiled genuinely at her tablemates, how she listened intently when they spoke. That was the Sandra he knew, kind, attentive, real in an industry built on illusion. He also noticed the group of women who kept looking her way, their expressions far from friendly. As the main course was served, the volume in the room rose with conversation and laughter. Sandra was enjoying her discussion with the elderly couple about their grandchildren when Tiffany's voice cut through the ambient noise. "I just don't understand why she still gets invited to these events," Tiffany said, her voice carrying just far enough. "It's not like she brings the press anymore." One of her friends giggled. "Maybe she's here to scout for a new husband. Third time's the charm." "Or to remind people she still exists," another added, loud enough that several nearby tables fell, awkwardly silent. Sandra felt heat rise to her cheeks. She kept her eyes on her plate, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. Her tablemates looked uncomfortable, the elderly woman patting Sandra's hand sympathetically. What Sandra didn't realize was that Keanu had moved closer during this exchange and had heard every word. His normally gentle eyes hardened as he watched Sandra try to maintain her dignity in the face of such petty cruelty. Without hesitation, he changed course, heading straight for Sandra's table. The room seemed to hold its breath as Keanu Reeves, known for both his acting talent and his legendary kindness, made his way through the crowd. People nudged each other, watching curiously. What was Keanu doing? Where was he going? Tiffany and her friends fell silent as Keanu walked past their table without acknowledgement, his focus entirely on Sandra. She looked up, surprised as he approached, a genuine smile spreading across her face at the sight of her old friend. "Sandra," he said warmly, his voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The grand ballroom of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel buzzed with the gentle clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of conversations. Sandra Bullock smoothed her simple black dress as she stepped through the ornate doorway. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, the same feeling she got before every public appearance, even after all these years in the spotlight. Tonight was different, though. No publicist shadowing her every move, no stylist fussing over her hair. Just Sandra, attending a charity gala because she believed in the cause, not because it would look good in the tabloids. "Ms. Bullock, over here!" A photographer called from the entrance. Sandra gave a polite smile and a quick pose before moving deeper into the room. She'd learned long ago that a few seconds of cooperation usually meant being left alone for the rest of the evening. The room was a sea of designer gowns and expensive jewelry. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Sandra accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and took a small sip, scanning the crowd for any familiar, friendly faces. "I can't believe they got the whole Johnson family to sponsor the East Wing," a woman nearby was saying. "Their donation must have been enormous." Sandra moved through the room, nodding politely to a few acquaintances. She noticed a group of women at the center table, their laughter a bit too loud, their jewelry a bit too flashy. At their center sat Tiffany Wilson, wife of studio executive Richard Wilson, known for her cutting remarks disguised as compliments. Sandra Bullock, said a voice behind her. I didn't expect to see you here. Sandra turned to find Paul Henderson, a director she'd worked with years ago. His smile seemed genuine enough. Paul, how are you? It's been ages. Too long. I've been working mostly in London these past few years, just flew in yesterday. He gestured around the room. Quite the turnout, isn't it? All for a good cause. The Hope Foundation does amazing work, Sandra agreed. Their literacy program has helped thousands of kids. Always the passionate one, Paul said with a smile. I remember that about you. Listen, we should catch up properly. I'm developing a new project that might interest you. I'd like that, Sandra said, meaning it. Paul excused himself to greet another colleague, leaving Sandra alone again. She found her assigned table, tucked somewhat to the side of the main floor. The placement wasn't lost on her, not quite important enough for the center tables anymore, it seemed. Her tablemates were an elderly couple who introduced themselves as longtime supporters of the foundation, a young tech entrepreneur, and 2 empty seats. We're so pleased to meet you, Ms. Bullock, the elderly woman said warmly. My granddaughter just loved that film where you were the FBI agent at the beauty pageant. We watched it together at Christmas. Sandra smiled genuinely. That's so nice to hear. It was a fun movie to make. Across the room, Keanu Reeves was just arriving, his entrance causing a subtle shift in the room's energy. He looked handsome in a classic black suit, his hair a bit longer than usual from his recent role. Unlike many celebrities, Keanu moved, with a quiet humility, shaking hands and making eye contact with everyone who approached him. The event organizer, a young woman named Lisa Chen, rushed over to greet him. Mr. Reeves, thank you so much for coming. I know you just got back from Europe yesterday. Wouldn't miss it, Keanu said with a warm smile. The Hope Foundation is doing important work. We've seated you near the stage since you'll be presenting the final award, Lisa explained, guiding him through the crowd. But feel free to mingle first, of course. Keanu nodded, but his eyes were already scanning the room. He'd heard Sandra would be here tonight, and he was looking forward to seeing his old friend and co-star. It had been too long. Meanwhile, Sandra was trying to enjoy her table's conversation, but she couldn't help noticing the glances from Tiffany's table. The women would look her way, whisper something, then laugh behind their hands. It was like high school all over again, and Sandra felt a flicker of the old insecurity she thought she'd long since overcome. Don't mind them, the elderly gentleman at her table said quietly, noticing her discomfort. Some people never grow up even when they grow old. Sandra gave him a grateful smile. Very true. Tell me more about your grandchildren. As dinner was being served, Keanu was still making his way around the room, stopping to chat with various guests. He spotted Sandra across the room and tried to catch her eye, but she was engaged in conversation with her tablemates. At the center table, Tiffany Wilson and her friends were growing louder with each glass of champagne. Look at her, trying so hard to be relevant, Tiffany said, her voice carrying just far enough. That dress is practically off the rack. I heard she's been turned down for 3 major roles this year, added her friend, a woman with an impossibly tight facelift. Apparently the studios want fresh faces. Fresh faces or just fresher faces, another woman said with a cruel laugh. We all have to accept aging eventually. Sandra kept her expression neutral as the comments drifted her way. Years in Hollywood had taught her to develop a thick skin, but the barb still stung. She focused on her salad, pushing arugula around the plate. Excuse me, she said to her tablemates. I'm just going to visit the ladies' room. In the elegant marble bathroom. Sandra took a moment to herself, straightening her already straight dress and touching up her lipstick. The door swung open and 2 women from Tiffany's table entered, continuing their conversation as if the bathroom were empty. Richard says her last film barely broke even, one said, fixing her already perfect hair. The studio won't work with her again. Well, can you blame them? She's what, 50-something now? The camera isn't kind after 40, especially with those under-eye bags. And showing up alone again, so desperate. Sandra stepped out of the stall, startling both women. She washed her hands calmly, dried them on a soft towel, and walked out, without saying a word, leaving the women frozen in embarrassment, or perhaps just surprise at being caught. When she returned to the ballroom, the first course was being cleared. Sandra noticed that Keanu had been seated at a table near the stage, surrounded by event organizers and major donors. Their eyes met across the room, and Keanu gave her that familiar warm smile, raising his hand in a small wave. Sandra returned the gesture, feeling a little lighter. The main course was served as the Hope Foundation's director took to the podium to thank everyone for their support. Sandra tried to focus on his speech about the foundation's accomplishments over the past year, but Tiffany's table had grown even more boisterous. "I don't understand why she even bothers coming to these things anymore," Tiffany said, not bothering to lower her voice. "It's not like anyone's interested in her these days." "Maybe she's just here for the free meal," one of her friends suggested, causing several of them to laugh loudly enough that people at nearby tables turned to look. The foundation director paused briefly in his speech, thrown off by the interruption, then continued. Sandra felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, not for herself but for these grown women behaving so poorly at a charity event. From his table, Keanu noticed the commotion and the direction of the women's gazes. He saw Sandra sitting tall, dignified despite the clear targeting. His brow furrowed slightly, the only outward sign of his growing irritation. As the director wrapped up his speech and dinner continued, Keanu excused himself from his table. The room was large enough that his movement didn't immediately draw attention, but heads turned as he made his way deliberately across the floor. Tiffany was in the middle of another cutting remark when she noticed Keanu approaching. And really, when was the last time she was even nominated for? She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. Keanu walked right past their table without a glance, heading straight for Sandra. The women fell silent, watching as he approached. Sandra's table with that distinctive walk of his, casual yet purposeful. Sandra looked up, surprise and genuine pleasure lighting her face as she saw her old friend coming toward her. For a moment, the rest of the room faded away. The petty comments, the social politics, all of it meaningless in the presence of true friendship. "Sandra," Keanu said warmly, his voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The elderly couple at Sandra's table exchanged delighted looks as Keanu Reeves, one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, pulled out an empty chair beside Sandra and sat down as if he belonged there all along. "Keanu," Sandra said, her smile reaching, her eyes for the first time that evening. "I didn't know you'd be here. Didn't you just finish filming in Prague?" "Got back yesterday," he said, accepting a glass of water from a waiter. "Wouldn't miss this. The Hope Foundation is doing incredible work." Tiffany and her friends were now openly staring, their previous target forgotten as they whispered urgently among themselves. The shift in the room's energy was palpable. All eyes on Sandra's table, where Keanu Reeves was now engaged in animated conversation with the woman they'd been mocking all evening. The soft clink of silverware against fine china filled the ballroom as waiters served the main course. Sandra felt a wave of comfort wash over her with Keanu sitting beside her. His presence had always had that effect, a calm in the storm, genuine in an industry built on pretense. "You look well," Keanu said, his voice low enough that only their table could hear. "That film you did last year, the one about the lighthouse keeper, it was beautiful work." Sandra smiled, touched that he'd seen it. The film had been a small independent project, a passion piece that hadn't made much money but had meant a great deal to her. "Thank you. Not many people saw that one." "Their loss," he replied simply. The elderly couple at their table watched this exchange with warm interest. The gentleman who had introduced himself earlier as Dr. Wilson leaned forward. "We saw it too. Reminded me of my childhood in Maine. You captured something very real there." "The scene in the storm," his wife added, "where you're trying to keep the light going, I held my breath the whole time." Sandra felt a rush of gratitude for these kind people. "That means more than you know." Across the room, Tiffany and her friends were now watching with undisguised interest. Their earlier mockery had transformed into frantic whispers and sidelong glances. "Did you know they were friends?" One woman with an enormous diamond necklace asked Tiffany. "Of course," Tiffany lied smoothly. They did that movie together years ago, the bus one. Speed, corrected another woman, adjusting her designer glasses. And another one later, the lake house time travel thing. The lake house, the first, woman said. My daughter loved that one. Tiffany's smile had turned brittle. Well, it's nice that they still support each other. In this industry, you need all the friends you can get, especially when your career is waning. At Sandra's table, the conversation had turned to the charity's work. The young tech entrepreneur was explaining how his company had been helping implement the foundation's digital literacy program in underserved schools. The results have been incredible, he said enthusiastically. Reading scores up 30% in just 1 year. That's what matters. Keanu nodded, making a real difference in kids' lives. Sandra watched him as he spoke, struck again by his genuine interest in others. No wonder people loved working with him. In an industry filled with massive egos, Keanu had always remained grounded, kind, interested in the world beyond himself. The dinner continued pleasantly, their table now in a bubble of warm conversation while the rest of the room seemed to orbit around them. Sandra noticed that several people who had barely glanced her way earlier were now finding reasons to walk past their table, hoping to catch Keanu's eye or be included in their circle. When dessert was served, an elaborate chocolate creation that looked too beautiful to eat, the foundation director returned to the podium. He thanked the major donors and announced the evening's fundraising total, which drew appreciative applause. Before we move to the dance floor, he continued, I'd like to take a moment to recognize some special guests with us tonight who have been tremendous supporters of our work. He began reading from a list naming wealthy philanthropists and corporate sponsors. Each stood briefly for acknowledgement as their names were called. Sandra didn't expect to be mentioned. She'd made her donations anonymously, as she always did. And a very special thanks to Sandra Bullock, the director said suddenly, whose generous contribution last month will fund our new mobile library program, bringing books to children in rural communities. A spotlight found Sandra, who blinked in surprise. She hadn't wanted recognition. That wasn't why she gave. She stood briefly, nodding in acknowledgement as the room applauded. As she sat back down, she glanced questioningly at Keanu, who shrugged innocently. Did you say something to them? She whispered. They asked if I knew who made the anonymous donation, he admitted. I thought you deserved recognition. Before Sandra could respond, the director continued. And of course our gratitude to Keanu Reeves, whose matching donation doubled the impact of this incredible gift. Now it was Keanu's turn to look surprised as the spotlight found him. He stood somewhat reluctantly, offering a small wave before quickly sitting back down. Sandra raised an eyebrow. Matching donation? It was a good cause, he said simply. At the center table, Tiffany and her friend sat in stunned silence. The woman with the tight facelift leaned toward Tiffany. Did he say mobile library program? That's almost $1 million. Tiffany's face had lost some of its color. I had no idea she was still that involved. My husband says she's one of the most generous people in Hollywood, another woman admitted quietly. Always anonymous, never asks for recognition. Tiffany shot her a sharp look. You never mentioned that before. The woman shrugged. You never seemed interested in hearing anything positive about her. As the formal part of the evening concluded, the orchestra began playing, and couples moved to the dance floor. The room's energy shifted, becoming more relaxed as people mingled freely between tables. Sandra noticed Tiffany and two of her friends making their way toward their table, plastered-on smiles firmly in place. She felt a flash of anxiety, then pushed it aside. She had nothing to prove to these women. Sandra, darling, Tiffany cooed as if they were old friends. What a lovely surprise to see you tonight. And Keanu, how marvelous you could both make it. Keanu stood politely but made no move to embrace Tiffany or her friends. Good evening, he said, his tone courteous but cool. That donation announcement was quite something. Tiffany continued, placing a hand on Sandra's arm. You should have told us you were involved with the literacy program. My foundation does similar work. We really must collaborate. Sandra smiled thinly. I prefer to keep my charitable work private typically. Oh, of course, of course. Tiffany nodded vigorously. So much more meaningful that way. I always say the same thing, don't I, ladies? It's about the cause, not the recognition. Her friends nodded in enthusiastic agreement, as if they hadn't spent the evening mocking the very person they were now flattering. Dr. Wilson, the elderly gentleman, cleared his throat. Ms. Bullock, I believe you promised to tell me more about that underwater filming technique from your ocean documentary. Yes, I did, Sandra said gratefully, turning away from Tiffany. If you'll excuse us. Tiffany's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. Keanu, we'd love for you to join us at our table for a drink. Richard, my husband, is such an admirer of your work. Keanu glanced at Sandra, then back to Tiffany. Thank you, but I'm catching up with old friends tonight, another time perhaps. Dismissed, Tiffany and her friends had no choice but to retreat, their whispered conversation now tense and brittle. Sandra watched them go, feeling no satisfaction in their discomfort, only a weary relief that the encounter was over. Those are some interesting friends you have, Keanu commented dryly. Sandra laughed. Not friends, just Hollywood. Ah, he nodded, understanding perfectly. The elderly couple excused themselves to get some air, leaving Sandra and Keanu briefly alone at the table. For a moment, neither spoke, enjoying the comfortable silence that comes with old friendship. Thank you, Sandra said finally. For what you did. Did I do something? Keanu asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. You know exactly what you did, she smiled. Showing up at my table, revealing my donation. Very sneaky, Reeves. He shrugged. I just sat with a friend. The rest was already there. Your generosity, your talent. I just made sure people didn't miss it. The orchestra began playing a slow melody and Keanu stood, offering his hand. Dance with me, for old time's sake. Sandra placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. As they began to move with the music, she noticed Tiffany and her group watching, their expressions a mix of envy and calculation. Your fan club is still watching, Keanu murmured, subtly guiding them to a less visible part of the dance floor. Let them watch, Sandra said, surprising herself with how little she cared now. Their opinion means nothing. As they danced, Sandra found herself relaxing fully for the first time that evening. You know, I almost didn't come tonight, she admitted. These events, they're not always kind places. I know, Keanu said simply. People forget what matters. They get caught up in status and who's in this week. And you never did, she observed. All these years, all your success, and you're still just Keanu. He smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Life's too short for anything else. Too precious. Sandra nodded, knowing he was thinking of the losses he'd endured. Losses that had shaped him but never hardened him. That was the miracle of Keanu, how he'd kept his heart open despite everything. Across the room, a photographer raised his camera, capturing the moment. Two old friends dancing, comfortable in each other's presence, genuine in a room where authenticity was rare. The flash went unnoticed by Sandra and Keanu, lost in conversation and the gentle sway of the music. Did you ever wonder, Sandra asked, what would have happened if we'd taken different paths, if we hadn't become actors? Keanu considered this. I think we'd have found our way to who we are somehow. Different roads, same destination. And who are we? She asked, curious about his perception. People trying their best, he said simply. Making mistakes, learning, trying to leave things a little better than we found them. As the music ended, they remained on the dance floor a moment longer. I'm glad you were here tonight, Sandra said softly. Me too, Keanu replied. And in his eyes, she saw nothing but honest friendship, the real thing, rare and precious in their world of carefully crafted images. As Sandra and Keanu returned to their table after their dance, the evening's energy shifted. The foundation director approached the microphone again, tapping it gently to get everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special part of our program now, As you know, tonight is not just about raising funds, but also recognizing those who have made extraordinary contributions to our cause. He smiled broadly, looking around the room. And we are incredibly fortunate to have with us someone who has agreed to present our final award of the evening. Please welcome to the stage, Keanu Reeves. Applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Keanu looked momentarily surprised. He knew he'd be presenting something, but not quite so soon. "That's your cue," Sandra said with a smile, giving his arm a gentle squeeze. Keanu made his way to the stage, his walk unhurried but purposeful. He had always moved with that distinctive grace, Sandra thought. Never rushed, never performing, just genuinely himself whether cameras were rolling or not. "Thank you," Keanu said as he reached the microphone, his voice warm but slightly reserved in the way his fans had come to love. "It's an honor to be here tonight supporting the Hope Foundation's incredible work." At the center table, Tiffany and her friends had shifted their attention entirely to Keanu, their earlier target forgotten as they leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "You know," Keanu continued, "we talk a lot about charity in Hollywood. It's easy to write checks and attend galas." He paused, looking around the room. "But real change comes from sustained commitment, from people who give not just money but time and heart, often without recognition." Sandra watched from her table, recognizing the thoughtful, slightly philosophical tone Keanu took when speaking about things that mattered to him. He wasn't a natural public speaker. There was always a hint of shyness in his manner, but his sincerity drew people in more effectively than polished charisma ever could. "The award I'm presenting tonight recognizes not just financial support, but the kind of quiet dedication that transforms lives," Keanu explained. "I've been fortunate enough to see this work firsthand. Last year, I visited one of the Hope Foundation's reading programs in a neighborhood where schools had lost their funding for libraries. The room grew quiet, everyone's attention fixed on Keanu's words. I met a little boy there, about 8 years old." Keanu continued, his expression softening at the memory. "He told me he'd never owned a book before the program came to his school, not one. Now he reads to his younger sister every night." He paused, letting the impact of his words sink in. "That's what we're really supporting here tonight. Not just an organization, but countless moments like that. Moments that change the direction of a life." Sandra felt a lump in her throat. This was why she donated to the mobile library program, for those children, those moments. Keanu looked down at the card in his hand. "The Beacon of Hope Award recognizes someone whose contribution has gone beyond financial support to create lasting change in children's lives." He looked up, his eyes finding Sandra's across the room. "This year's recipient has funded literacy programs in over 50 schools, volunteered countless hours reading to children in hospitals, and most recently made possible our new mobile library program, bringing books to rural communities where children have limited access to reading materials." Sandra's heart began to beat faster. She hadn't known anything about an award. Her anonymous donation wasn't supposed to be linked to her publicly. "What makes this contribution special," Keanu continued, "is that it was made with no expectation of recognition. In fact, the donor specifically requested to remain anonymous." A murmur went through the crowd. Tiffany leaned over to whisper to her friend, clearly trying to guess who the mystery donor might be. "But sometimes," Keanu said with a small smile, "people deserve to be recognized even when they don't seek it. So it's my great pleasure to present this year's Beacon of Hope Award to someone whose generosity is matched only by her humility, Sandra Bullock." The spotlight found Sandra at her table. She sat frozen for a moment, genuinely shocked. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd always kept her charitable work private, believing that public recognition somehow diminished the purity of the giving. The room erupted in applause, people rising to their feet. Even Tiffany and her friends stood, though their expressions showed more shock than genuine appreciation. Sandra rose slowly, making her way to the stage. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions: embarrassment at being the center of attention, discomfort at having her private giving made public, but also a touch of validation. Perhaps there was value in being recognized, if only to inspire others. As she reached the stage, Keanu handed her a beautiful crystal award, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "Sorry for the surprise," he whispered, "but not sorry for celebrating you." Sandra took a deep breath as she faced the crowd, the crystal award heavy in her hands. She hadn't prepared any remarks, never expecting to be in this position. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "This is unexpected." A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. "I've always believed that giving works best when it's private," Sandra continued honestly, "when it's not about recognition or tax breaks or seeing your name on a building." She looked out at the sea of faces, some genuinely moved, others calculating, assessing her new status in their social hierarchy. Tiffany and her friends watched. With tight smiles, their earlier mockery transformed into strained admiration. "But Keanu reminded me of something important tonight," Sandra said, glancing at her friend who stood supportively at the side of the stage.
"Sometimes sharing our giving does matter. Not for praise, but because it might inspire others to give too." She held up the award slightly. "I accept this on behalf of all the children who will discover worlds beyond their own through books."
Because that's what this is really about. When I was a little girl in Virginia, books were my escape, my education, my comfort. Every child deserves that gift. The crowd applauded again, many nodding in agreement. Sandra noticed several people at the wealthiest tables exchanging thoughtful glances, perhaps reconsidering their own giving. The mobile library program will reach children in communities where the nearest library might be 50 miles away, Sandra explained, her passion for the project evident in her voice. Children who've never had a library card, never experienced the simple joy of choosing their own book. That matters more than any movie I'll ever make, any award I'll ever receive. She looked directly at Keanu, her expression warm with gratitude. "And I'd like to thank Keanu Reeves not just for this surprise," she gestured to the award, "but for matching the donation dollar for dollar. He didn't tell me he was doing that." It was Keanu's turn to look slightly uncomfortable as the crowd's attention shifted to him. He gave a small, modest shrug that made several people laugh affectionately. "That's Keanu for you," Sandra said, smiling. "Always doing good, never wanting credit." She turned serious again. "I hope tonight inspires all of us to find our own way to make a difference, whether it's through this foundation or another cause close to your heart. Thank you." With that, she stepped away from the microphone to enthusiastic applause. As she and Keanu left the stage together, the foundation director announced that the dance floor was officially open and the orchestra struck up a lively tune. "You're not mad at me, are you?" Keanu asked quietly as they made their way back through the crowd. Sandra shook her head. "I could never be mad at you, but you could have warned me." "Where's the fun in that?" he replied with a hint of mischief. "Besides, you deserved this moment." As they reached the bottom of the stage steps, Tiffany and her group swooped in, their demeanor completely transformed from earlier in the evening. "Sandra, darling," Tiffany exclaimed, air-kissing both her cheeks. "What an incredible speech. I had no idea you were so involved with children's literacy. I've mentioned it several times at previous events," Sandra said mildly, remembering clearly how Tiffany had dismissed her passion project as quaint just last year. "Well, it's absolutely wonderful," Tiffany continued, unruffled. "You know, my foundation has been looking to partner on exactly this kind of program. We should have lunch next week. My treat, of course." Before Sandra could respond, Tiffany had turned her attention to Keanu. "And Keanu, you wonderful man, that matching donation, so generous. Richard and I are hosting a small dinner at our home next month for some very special supporters. You simply must come. Both of you," she added, almost as an afterthought. Keanu exchanged a quick glance with Sandra, a silent communication born of years of friendship. "Thank you for the invitation," he said politely. "We'll check our schedules." Another woman from Tiffany's group, the one with the tight facelift, pushed forward. "Sandra, I've been meaning to reach out. My daughter is directing her first independent film and she would absolutely die if you could just read the script. It would be perfect for you. A strong female lead, very age-appropriate." Sandra managed a polite smile. "Have her agent send it to my agent." I'm always looking for good material. Of course, I'll tell her tonight. The woman beamed, already reaching for her phone. More people were gathering around them now, drawn by the combined star power of Sandra and Keanu and the night's revelations about their charitable work. Questions and compliments flew from all directions. About the literacy program, about their upcoming projects, about whether they might work together again. Amid the crush, Keanu leaned close to Sandra's ear. Want to make an escape? She nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Keanu had always understood her discomfort with this kind of attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Keanu said to the growing crowd around them, if you'll excuse us, Sandra and I have some foundation business to discuss. With polite but firm determination, he created a path through the throng, Sandra following in his wake. They made their way toward one of the ballroom's side doors that led to a quiet terrace overlooking the hotel gardens. The night air was cool and refreshing after the heat of the ballroom. Sandra took a deep breath, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders. Thank you for the rescue. Anytime, Keanu said simply, leaning against the stone balustrade. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, looking out at the garden where subtle lighting illuminated flowering trees and a small fountain. Funny how quickly they changed their tune, Sandra observed, thinking of Tiffany and her friends. People like that always do, Keanu replied. It's not about you. It never was. It's about what they think you can do for them, how being associated with you might raise their own status. I know, Sandra sighed. I've been in this business long enough to understand that. It still stings sometimes, though. Keanu nodded. The fakeness never stops being exhausting. From inside, they could hear the music and laughter continuing. The party would go on for hours yet. Wealthy donors drinking expensive champagne and making connections that would benefit them in ways that had little to do with children's literacy. You know what the sad thing is? Sandra said after a moment. Some of those women have children who could be such enthusiastic readers, such compassionate people. But what example are they setting? That's why your program matters, Keanu reminded her. Books show kids different ways of being, different values. Sometimes the right book at the right time can change a child's whole perspective. Sandra smiled, touched by his understanding. That's exactly it. That's why I keep doing this, even when these events drive me crazy. The garden terrace offered, a peaceful escape from the noise and pretense of the ballroom. Sandra leaned against the stone railing, the crystal award still in her hands, its facets catching the soft outdoor lighting. Keanu stood beside her, his presence calm and steady as always. Do you ever get tired of it all? Sandra asked, her voice soft in the night air. The galas, the fake smiles, people wanting pieces of you? Keanu considered her question, taking his time as he always did before speaking. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I remember why we're really here. The foundation work? That, yes. But more than that, he gestured toward the award she held. Making something good happen in a world that can be pretty dark sometimes. From inside, they could hear the orchestra starting another song, the melody drifting out to the terrace. The sounds of laughter and conversation continued, the party in full swing now that the formal portion of the evening had concluded. They'll be wondering where we are, Sandra said, though she made no move to return. Let them wonder, Keanu replied with a small smile. A comfortable silence fell between them. That was one of the things Sandra had always appreciated about their friendship, the ease of quiet moments, never feeling the need to fill space with empty words. After a while, the glass door to the terrace slid open, and Dr. Wilson, the elderly gentleman from their table, stepped out. Ah, there you are, hiding from your admirers? Sandra laughed. Just getting some air. Mind if I join you? My wife has been cornered by a chatty donor, and these old ears can only take so much ballroom noise. Please, Keanu gestured to a nearby bench. Dr. Wilson settled himself down with the careful movements of someone whose joints didn't work quite as well as they once had. Quite the revelation in there, he said, nodding toward the award. Your mobile library program. My wife and I were quite moved. Thank you, Sandra said. It means a lot to hear that. I was a teacher for 40 years, Dr. Wilson said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. In a small town in Montana, many of my students had never been to a proper library before they came to my classroom. That's exactly who we're trying to reach. Sandra leaned forward, genuinely interested. What made the biggest difference for those children, in your experience? As Dr. Wilson shared stories from his teaching days, Sandra found herself forgetting all about Tiffany and her cruel friends. This was the real world, people who had dedicated their lives to helping others, who understood what really mattered. Inside the ballroom, Tiffany and her group had noticed the absence of the night's two biggest stars. Their efforts to appear casual while scanning the room weren't particularly subtle. Where did they disappear to? The woman with the tight facelift wondered, craning her neck to see over the crowd. Probably stepped out to discuss their next project together, another suggested. I heard they're considering a reunion film. Tiffany sipped her champagne, her expression sour despite her attempt to appear unbothered. I still can't believe she's the one behind the mobile library program. My donation was substantial too, you know. The West Wing renovation is entirely funded by us. Yes, dear, we know. Her friend patted her arm. You've mentioned it several times. The foundation director approached their table, all smiles. Mrs. Wilson, I wanted to thank you again for your generous support of our West Wing renovation. Tiffany brightened immediately. Of course, Thomas, the Wilson family has always believed in supporting literacy. She lowered her voice confidentially. I must say, though, I was surprised by tonight's award choice. Surely there were other candidates who've been more consistently supportive over the years? The director's smile remained fixed, but his eyes cooled slightly. Actually, Mrs. Wilson, Sandra Bullock has been one of our most dedicated supporters for over a decade. Most of her contributions have been anonymous. Tonight was the first time we've been permitted to acknowledge her publicly. A decade? Tiffany couldn't hide her surprise. But I've never seen her at any of the board meetings or planning committees. She prefers to work directly with the children, he explained. She volunteers in our reading program twice a month. No publicity, no photographers. Just her, sitting on the floor with kids helping them discover books. He checked his watch. If you'll excuse me, I need to speak with some of our other donors. As he walked away, Tiffany's friends exchanged glances. Did you know about this? One whispered to another. How would I? She never mentions it. Unlike some people, Tiffany pretended not to hear, her face flushing slightly as she signaled a waiter for another glass of champagne. Back on the terrace, Sandra, Keanu, and Dr. Wilson had been joined by Mrs. Wilson and the young tech entrepreneur from their dinner table. The conversation had turned to the practical challenges of getting books to remote communities. The real issue is sustainability, the tech entrepreneur was saying. One-time donations are wonderful, but these programs need ongoing support. That's where the endowment comes in, Sandra explained. The initial donation establishes the program, but we've created a fund that will generate ongoing revenue to maintain it. Smart, Keanu nodded. Too many good programs die after the first year because the funding dries up. Mrs. Wilson, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. You know what I love about both of you? In all this discussion about books and children and funding, neither of you has mentioned your films or awards or celebrity status. It's refreshing. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a quick glance, both smiling. There's more to life than movies, Sandra said simply. Much more, Keanu agreed. Their small group's conversation continued, touching on education policy, the impact of technology on reading habits, and personal stories about books that had changed their lives. It was the kind of genuine exchange that rarely happened at these galas, where networking and being seen typically took precedence over meaningful connection. Inside, the party had reached that point in the evening where some guests were leaving while others were settling in for another hour of dancing and drinking. The foundation director approached the microphone one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, as our wonderful evening begins to wind down, I want to thank you all again for your tremendous support, and a special thank you to our award recipients and presenters tonight. He gestured toward the terrace doors. I believe our Beacon of Hope Award winner is enjoying a well-deserved moment of peace, but let's give Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves another round of applause for their extraordinary generosity. The crowd obliged enthusiastically, many looking toward the terrace doors with curious expressions. Their combined contribution will bring books and the joy of reading to over 5,000 children who currently have no access to libraries. The director continued. That's a legacy that will change lives for generations to come. On the terrace, they could hear the applause but continued their conversation, none of them particularly interested in returning to the spotlight. I should probably make an appearance. Before leaving, Sandra said eventually, glancing at her watch. It would seem rude to disappear entirely. I'll come with you, Keanu offered. Safety in numbers. They all laughed, understanding exactly what he meant. The Wilsons and the tech entrepreneur decided to call it a night, exchanging contact information with promises to stay in touch about the literacy program. As Sandra and Keanu prepared to re-enter the ballroom, she placed a hand on his arm. Thank you for everything tonight. I didn't do anything special, he said with characteristic humility. You showed up, she said simply. Sometimes that's the most important thing anyone can do. Keanu nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. In a business where people were constantly reinventing themselves, discarding old connections in favor of more advantageous ones, true friendship was rare and precious. They stepped back into the ballroom together, immediately, drawing attention. Tiffany and two of her friends approached quickly as if afraid they might escape again. There you are, Tiffany exclaimed, her voice overly bright. We've been looking everywhere for you. Sandra, darling, I simply must introduce you to my husband. Before you go, he's a huge fan of your work, the serious films, of course, not just the commercial ones. Sandra recognized the clumsy attempt at flattery for what it was, but smiled politely. That's very kind. And Keanu, another woman chimed in. My son would absolutely die if he could get a video message from you. He's at boarding school in Switzerland. Poor thing. So homesick. Keanu nodded. Have your assistant contact mine. Happy to help. A photographer approached, asking if he could take a picture of Sandra and Keanu with their award. They agreed, standing close together, both with natural smiles that reached their eyes. One more with Mrs. Wilson? The photographer suggested, gesturing to Tiffany. Before either could respond, Tiffany had inserted herself between them, one arm linked through Keanu's, the other around Sandra's waist. Perfect. This is going straight into the Foundation newsletter, she gushed. 3 passionate supporters of children's literacy. The flash went off, capturing Tiffany's triumphant smile, Sandra's polite one, and Keanu's slightly bemused expression. I really must be going, Sandra said as soon as the photo was taken. Early call tomorrow. Of course, Tiffany nodded vigorously. But we simply must have lunch next week. I'll have my assistant call yours. Do that, Sandra said, knowing it would never happen. She'd instructed her assistant long ago about which lunch invitations to politely decline. As they made their way toward the exit, more people approached, wanting just a moment, just a word, just a photo. Sandra and Keanu handled each interaction with grace but continued moving steadily toward the door. Finally, they reached the lobby, where the valet was already bringing around their cars. Need a ride home? Keanu offered. My driver would be happy to drop you off. I have my car, but thank you, Sandra replied. It was really good to see you, Keanu. We shouldn't let so much time pass between visits. Agreed, he said, his eyes warm with genuine affection. Life's too short for only seeing good friends at charity events. They embraced, a real hug between old friends, not the air kisses and false warmth that had dominated the evening. By the way, Keanu said as they parted, those women, they were wrong about you, about everything. Sandra smiled, touched by his protective instinct. I know, but thank you for reminding me. Any time. As they waited for their respective cars, Sandra looked back at the hotel ballroom, visible through the grand windows. Tiffany and her friends were still inside, already, latched onto some other celebrity, already forgetting the lessons of the evening. You know what's funny? Sandra said thoughtfully. They'll never understand what they missed tonight. What's that? Keanu asked. The chance to be real, to make genuine connections, to talk about things that actually matter. She shrugged. Their loss. Keanu nodded, understanding perfectly. Their loss, indeed. Sandra's car arrived first, a sleek black sedan with a trusted driver she'd worked with for years. Before getting in, she turned to Keanu one last time. See you soon? For real? For real, he promised. I'll call you next week. As Sandra's car pulled away, she felt a lightness she hadn't expected at the beginning of the evening. What had started as an uncomfortable obligation had transformed into something meaningful. A reconnection with an old friend, a reminder of what truly mattered in a world that often confused celebrity with importance. In her lap, the Crystal Award caught the passing streetlights, sending tiny rainbows across the car's interior. It was beautiful, yes, but nowhere near as valuable as the moments of genuine connection she'd experienced tonight. With the Wilsons, with the foundation director, and especially with Keanu. Some things, Sandra reflected as the city lights blurred, past her window couldn't be bought with all the wealth in Beverly Hills. Real friendship, authentic purpose, the knowledge that somewhere, children who had never owned a book would soon be discovering worlds between pages, their lives expanding, in ways Tiffany and her friends could never understand. That more than any award or recognition was the